Our next speaker is Professor Agata Bielik Robson, Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Nottingham, and she will speak about Between Unity and Chaos and in Rosenzweig's narrative philosophy. Professor Bielik.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. And once again, I would like to congratulate Irene Caillon on this wonderful topic which she had invented, which actually is a very serious challenge, which I will try to answer in my paper. I listened to Orietta's Ambrosi's talk today when she was talking about the spatiality of the particle "and" in Rosenzweig. What I'm trying to do today is something complementary to this spatial approach. I would like to show how "and" functions in Rosenzweig's very peculiar metaphysics of time, how it actually structures his absolutely innovative metaphysics of temporality. And this is the motto. This is the epigraph, which I'm not going to read. It's a quote from Star of Redemption in which the "and" is introduced for the first time in connection to two other primal words, which is yes and no, and how they actually connect, bind, but in a non-conflictual, conjunctive manner, this yes and no within the nature of God. The PowerPoint presentation will be no images, I'm afraid. It will be very dry and boring, but because quite a lot of you, me including here, are not English native speakers, I thought that I basically present all my lecture in the form of a PowerPoint, so you could also read it out from the screen. Okay? Have you read the motto? Yes? Are we ready? Okay. No, well. Is it large enough? Not really, but okay. I'll begin then. The aim of my paper is to present Rosenzweig's unique continuation of Schelling's narrative philosophy as grounded in the power of the little word "and." While Schelling attempts to tell the philosophical saga of Weltarter, the ages of the world, with the means of dialectic, Rosenzweig gives up on the dialectical method in order to create a narrative which is based on a sequence. On Rosenzweig's account, Schelling's erzählende philosophy is hindered by a dialectical imperialism in which each of the positions or potencies, negation, affirmation, and reconciliation, wants to surpass and sublate the remaining two, and because of that arrests the flow of the story and claims the whole for itself. Aware of Schelling's shortcomings, Rosenzweig avoids this pitfall by carefully sequencing yes and no in such a way that they never get fully reconciled and thus exhausted in their dynamics. This mechanism of narrative sequencing can be best demonstrated on the three examples which constitutes the main themes of the three subsequent parts of the Star. First, the metaphysical transition from configuration of elements to creation proper, which comes after but does not negate the former stage. Second, the metaethical inductive mechanism of neighborly love, which adds the singular neighbors one by one thanks to the conjunctive "and, and in this manner avoids any totalization. And third, the complementary relation between Judaism and Christianity, free of any supersessionist logic on either side. The conclusion we can draw from these examples is that the success of Rosenzweig's narrative philosophy lies in creating a plastic middle between unity and chaos, between rigid conceptual totality, characteristic of all philosophy from Ionia to Jena, and the anarchy of brute facts. In what follows, I will focus on the first and most important example of the three already mentioned, the creation as the birth of the story, which proceeds as the sequence based on the conjunctive power of and then, and so on. The next, please. In The Star of Redemption, Rosenzweig explicitly admits that he is following the path of Schelling's later philosophy, which includes his narrative method of thinking, positive philosophy, and mystical empiricism. Yet, Rosenzweig also tries to solve Schelling's aporia and turn his own narrative into something more than just the odyssey of the spirit. The term Schelling himself used to describe his whole project, in which God first becomes alienated from his divinity and then, in the end, comes back to himself. After all, as Levinas will say about 1.5 centuries later, in reference to both Schelling and Hegel, Odyssey is a circuitous journey, and it is precisely its nostos motif, the orientation of homecoming, that makes it a myth, a form articulating the immanence, as opposed to the journey of Abraham, who is pushed away from his origins and wanders off, this inaugurating the act of exodus, a narrative form capable to articulate the occurring of radical transcendence. If the whole Schellingian story indeed consists in the inner quarrel, then self-alienation, and then homecoming of the divine will, then how can it guarantee an autonomous existence of the created reality? And in everything is only and always in God and never leaves the divine immanence, how can this position be reconciled with the Aristotelian thrust on Schelling's positive philosophy, which welcomes the Überschwänglichkeit, the excessivity of being, which most assuredly exists with such mystical enthusiasm? The problem Schelling encounters is precisely the ontological status of created being. On the one hand, its reality appears absolutely positive, yet on the other hand, the system reduces it to a mere derivative coming from the inner split in the Godhead, which eventually must be undone in the therapeutic process of God coming back to himself. This is why the Weltarte project, with its odyssey of the spirit, had to be abandoned and never properly finished. The promised story could not mature into a story proper. Just as God, its main subject, could never create anything outside himself, the story could not exhibit the Egypt of circuitous myths either. But this is precisely where Rosenzweig enters the stage. He wants a true story which will form a path leading away from its beginning and leaving it truly for good, in accordance with Abraham's parable of Lech Lecha, with the place of your origin and the Exodus narrative. A true story and a true creation. The next, please. On the surface, similarities and continuities abound, to such extent that many commentators of Rosenzweig tend to see him simply as a Jewish Schelling. Schelling, an openly Christian thinker, often resorts to the Trinitarian model, the therapeutic aspect of temporality divided into 3 aeons, past of the Father, presence of the Son, and the future of the Spirit. And the historical interpretation of Trinity, devised for the first time by Joachim da Fiore, go here hand in hand. The Trinitarian representation, which distributes the conflictual nature of God into the succession of past, present, and future, turns out to be the narrative medicine, time the healer, allowing God to return to his peaceful unity with himself. The same Trinitarian pattern will also resurface in Rosenzweig, though with a significant modification. Instead of employing the historical procession of Father, Son, and Spirit, Rosenzweig proposes to think in terms of Magen David, the six-pointed Jewish star made of two triangles. This construction follows closely the double Trinitarian process which Schelling describes in The Ages of the World, but with a twist. While in Schelling, the initial stage of God in his nature is marked by Unruhe, restlessness, and the hopeless rotational movement of inner contradiction, in Rosenzweig, the primordial world is absolutely static. All three elements, the Jewish trinity of God, man, world, are deeply hidden in their own natures, which they neither share nor show. They are withdrawn into themselves and immersed in the indifference. Their potential dialect conflict rests latent in them while they coexist without the awareness of one another. This is not late Schelling's stage of Verwirrung, confusion, but rather the indifference, his earlier concept, yet again cum modificatione. Not the night in which all cows are black, as Hegel once maliciously remarked, but a static configuration of the three different elements which do not yet demonstrate their difference, because, self-absorbed in their ipseity, they don't yet know about it. God, man, world are thus eternally there in the unvordenklich past of their non-communication. Next, please. And just as in Schelling, the decision of God to reveal himself in his essence inaugurates the process of history, in Rosenzweig too, the decisive moment of breaking into presence occurs when God makes a dialogic turn and addresses man in Revelation. Yet again, there comes the fundamental difference. Unlike in the Schellingian version of pantheism, in which God's body constitutes nature, the Rosenzweigian God is eternally and structurally separated from the other two elements. As if in the Jewish variant of the Socinian heresy, the primordial Trinity is not a triune ground of everything, but is truly made of three distinct moments. God the Creator, man, which is metaphorically the Son, representing the sonship of election, and world, which in the future will have become a medium of the redemptive practice, and as such can be regarded as the Rosenzweigian figure of spirit. This primordial tripartition, which breaks with the Neoplatonic genesis of all in the one, radically transforms the whole set of concepts which, even in Schelling struggling to become Aristotelian, still belongs to the Neoplatonic vocabulary. The genesis of being is no longer to be understood in terms of many proceeding from one, and the revelation is no more a process of God gaining self-knowledge and then regaining his lost integrity. Once the many is announced as the prius, the first thing, revelation can only mean entering into a dialogue of one with the remaining two, which forms the second triangle in Rosenzweig's notation. The secret of revelation, therefore, Okay, yeah, good, sorry. The secret of revelation, therefore, is relation, which will manifest itself in the grammar of end, not, as in Schelling, the selfless expansion which negates the original contraction, but the dialogic turn which counteracts the initial withdrawal, yet without annulling it. This is where we see for the first time the intervention of the narrative form based on sequencing, which is to replace the violent operation of dialectics. While in Schelling, God must vehemently negate his being in order to reveal his loving and selfless essence. In Rosenzweig, the three elements remain withdrawn and then enter into dialogic relation. Next, please. This latter disparity derives from the different use of the Lurianic motif of Tzimtzum, which in both Schelling, who was aware of this Kabbalistic concept, and Rosenzweig, plays a significant role. In Schelling Tzimtzum, the contraction is the primary divine potency responsible for the dark ground of being, the no preceding all yes. It is the negating tendency which craves being and thus draws it into itself, just as the Schellingian jealous God of the Hebrews, who contracts being and withdraws into concealment. In the Kabbalah of Schelling, the way he presents it, Tzimtzum is conducted only under the auspices of the Sephirah of Din, that is wrath and severity. It's an angry God who contracts. For Rosenzweig, however, Tzimtzum is a much more positive operation, in which contraction is not so much a withdrawal in wrath as the withdrawal of wrath. The curtailment of the divine egoity, which allows other beings to assert themselves in their ontological autonomy. This again happens thanks to the power of end, which makes possible to posit real otherness outside of God. It is indeed the negation of the divine expansion, but understood not in the purely negative terms of contracting being for oneself, but in terms of the original yes, letting other beings be. To the contrary, it is the expansion that Rosenzweig now perceives as the primordial threat, the danger of the all-consuming Allheit, immanent totality that must be counteracted. Hence, Tzimtzum, contraction, is here conceived as making room for the other, for man who must assert himself in his autonomy, and for the world, which is also let loose, abandoned to itself. The next. While in Schelling, contraction is the egotistical move done in anger and thus creating the dark ground of the real. An expansion is the altruistic countermaneuver of the revelation of love. In Rosenzweig, the reverse is true. The contraction is the act of yes, which allows free elements to come to the fore out of nothingness and into their separate existence. And the expansion is the act of no. The latter, on the one hand, opens the possibility of a dialogic relation, but on the other, poses constant threat to the freedom granted by the separation of elements. The revelation, therefore, is for Rosenzweig something of the Hölderlinian point of the intersection of the highest danger and the highest chance of salvation. If contained, it inaugurates dialogic relation proper. But if too expansive, it threatens to flood everything with love, to burn the soul to ashes, and thus destroy the fragile balance of the ontological difference. Thus, Although Schelling is clearly there in the background, delivering all the most important categories, the shifts within their use are enormous, and they are not at all accidental. They form a pattern of the Rosenzweigian Jewish clinamen from Schelling, which can be described as moving away from the latter's Gnostic negative inclinations, still very strongly present in all the drafts of the ages of the world, though significantly less in his latest Berlin lectures when he announces his positive philosophy. One could thus say that Rosenzweig realizes the tendency of Schelling himself by allowing his positive philosophy to truly depart from his former fixation on the dunkler Grund der Existenz, the dark ground of being, and the ominous, sinister nature of the real, which, like a black hole, pulls everything into itself and arrests all the movement. Late Schelling's farewell to his favorite earlier thinker, Jakob Böhme, the 17th century German mystic completely puzzled and, in Rosenzweig terms, paralyzed by the mystery of the divine evil will, finds its fulfillment in Rosenzweig, for whom the real, eternally divided into three elements, loses its regressive imperial power and opens itself to the progressive possibility of transformation and, eventually, redemption. Thanks to the original diffusion and separation, the power of and, the real no longer poses the impossible obstacle to the redemptive practice. The story can now really progress and move away from the beginnings, through the denouement and towards the finale, which will be something else than just a Schellingian return of God to God, who, in the meantime, learns how to live with his dark ground of being and heals himself of the will to create. Next. But it is not just this diffusion which disarms the eternal hindrance posed by the Schellingian real and its Gnostic Manichaean ever-presence of the irredeemable evil. Rosenzweig also refuses to acknowledge the original nothing of God with which the star begins as the dark ground of being. He emphasizes very strongly that although he follows premises of Schelling's positive philosophy, he rejects the hypostasis, which Schelling posits as the prius, the first thing, at the borderline between the negative and the positive approach. The final result of the negative philosophy, the nothing of God, must remain only cognitive and cannot pass into the positive philosophy as the hypostatic projection of our learned ignorance. Rosenzweig writes, "It, nothing, is situated before the yes and before the no. It would be situated before all beginning if it were situated, but it is not situated. It is only the virtual place for the beginning of our knowledge. It is only the mark that indicates that the problem is set. We strictly avoid giving it a name. It is not a dark ground or anything else that can be named with Eckhart, Böhme's, or Schelling's words. It is not at the beginning." Rosenzweig thus refuses to begin his story from the Ungrund, from the will, as the dark Seinsuchende searching for being, nullity, which impulsively contracts and jealously steals being for itself. He knows that if he conceded to Eckhart, Böhme, and Schelling this crucial starting point, he would never be able to develop his story successfully. The story which begins with creation and then goes through revelation and then ends with redemption. The dark beginnings would steal the whole show precisely the way they steal being for themselves. The jealous past would never loosen its grip on the present. "In my beginning is my end" is not a good model for a story. Next. According to Schelling, and Rosenzweig agrees with him, there is no story if it does not originate in the will. If there is no intention, as for instance in the Greek concept of the impersonal arche, philosophy can only take a systematic but never narrative form. For Schelling, the will necessary to propel the story must come from the voluntaristic God and his mysterious Wille zum Schaffen, will to create, which at the same time constitutes the dark ground of being. Rosenzweig, however, gives up precisely on the idea of the divine will in order to save his narrative plan. Why and how? The reason lies precisely in the circuitous outcome of Schelling's heroic poem, the irredeemability of the will, which poses the eternal obstacle to the redemptive practice, and as such functions indeed as a conversation stopper. The story can only continue so far, and then it will always encounter the blocking agent of the real, with its indivisible reminder of darkness and compulsion to repeat. The will may thus appear as an exciting beginning of the story, but soon it will arrest the narrative by the eternal return of the same, the recurrence of the past, its typically Freudian Wiederholungszwang, which, as we have already indicated, means regress into a myth, where the repetitive cycle of the unconscious forces overrules the sequence of the conscious desire for a future. The Rosenzweigian God, therefore, has freedom and power, but not will, which would render him arbitrary or capricious. His is strictly the potentia ordinata, the ordained power, which, according to God's essence, is always and only a power to create. Will, however, does not disappear completely from the configuration of the first elements. It now becomes the defining feature of man, and as such contributes to the narrative plot in which God, man, and world are involved. In his ultimate anti-Neoplatonic shattering of the all, which, as the Hebrew phrase shvirat hakolim nicely puns on the original Lurianic breaking of the vessels, which is shvirat hakelim, Rosenzweig also breaks with the Christian Neoplatonic doctrine of analogy, as above, so below, the presence of which can still be detected in Schelling. For Rosenzweig, man is tselem, God's image and likeness, but this relation has to be understood in terms of emulation, not mirroring or imitation. Man has a distinctly other role to play than God, and this difference expresses itself in the Koenian term, emulation, which combines the will to follow God with the element of separation, defiance, even rivalry. Next, please. As a finite will, opposite to and jealous of the infinite divine freedom, this is Rosenzweig's own words, jealous of the infinite divine freedom, it manifests itself as defiance, trotz, the power of the self in which the selfhood asserts its absolute separation, its metaphysical right to be in the mode of end, not in but outside God, not as an instance of some general idea concept, but as this man, standing next to other real beings, Platzhalter. Rosenzweig calls this position metaethical, meaning being beyond ethos or transcending the ethical totality towards absolute particularity, das Besondere, be. In his analysis of Aristotle's Poetics, Schelling claims that the story cannot be modeled on the conceptual automaton. It always needs a tyhe, a contingent accident which throws a grain of sand into the dialectical machine. Tyhe indicates drama. It brings in suspense, uncertainty, exigency, and struggle. Man's will is precisely this grain of sand, the tyhe which disturbs the automaton of the primordial configuration, not the divine will. It is the contingency of the metaethical human subject which inaugurates the story, and not the divine, unaccountable madness, the dark matrix of all things accidental, as in Eckhart, Böhme, or Schelling. Being meta may be indeed irrational in terms of the Kantian theory of the limits of reason, but it does not have to transform straight into madness. Just meta, not mad. This, however, is a severe departure from Schelling, also on a different ground. For Schelling, who still sympathizes with the Neoplatonic primacy of unity over the manifold, the isolated Selbstheit, which he talks about in his essay on human freedom, constitutes the root of all evil. Yet in Rosenzweig's system, which truly breaks with the Neoplatonic premises, perhaps as the first Western metaphysics ever, I emphasized it, the first Western metaphysics ever to break with the Neoplatonic matrix. Separation is a primary fact and not the secondary privation of the metaphysical goodness, oneness, being. Separation does not stand here under the sign of negation. It constitutes the essential moment of the originary yes and displays the primordial difference between three elements which gradually become aware of the difference and enter the mode of end. So while in Schelling, still more Neoplatonic than his own declarations might suggest, any tendency to break away from the oneness of the divine totality amounts to a cancerous rebellion of a cell against the organism. Rosenzweig is as far as possible from this romantic organic analogy. Not only separation is a factual prius which needs no proof, it is also desired as the object of human will, which wants to assert its absolute particularity. It is thus not only the hard positive fact of the original configuration, but also the object of intentional assertion. Yes, it was good, ki tov, which, according to the biblical narrative, inaugurates the process of creation proper. For it is due to man's defiant, tragic hybris, his apex quality of the metaethical sticking out from the world, that he becomes visible to God and attracts his attention. This is actually Lukácsian motif from his Metaphysics of Tragedy, very nicely elaborated by Rosenzweig. So he becomes visible to God and attracts his attention. Without this ferment caused by man's hubristic maladaptation to the totality of beings, everything would have stayed on the level of the static configuration only. The move indeed begins with the excess of the will, but not on God's part. It is the tragic hero who provokes God to action, that is the recognition of his singularity. And this is precisely how the greatest heroic poem of the will finally begins. Caused neither by the will which wants being, nor by the will which only wants itself, as in Schelling's Odyssey of the divine will, but by the human will which wants selfhood, the will to distinctness which cannot content itself with mere existing, but presses towards creation proper, in which beings, following the example of man, will step out of their indifference and become equally visible. Particulars will start coming one by one and this, and that, and now again something else, and so on. Next, please. Next, please. Yes, quickly. For Rosenzweig, creation proper is an ongoing process which supervenes on the original configuration. Creation does not consist in letting the infinite actuality emerge. The latter is merely a mechanical, mathematical moment of the origination occurring in God's interplay of forces. But what does it mean to create what already actually exists? That is, the world which is always already there? It is precisely in the answer to this question that Rosenzweig breaks most decisively with Neoplatonism, Schelling included. To create means to make other truly other, to break the wholes, that is, break the all into pieces, first into 3 pieces, and then, after the fermentation of othering begins, into more and more singularized fragments capable to prove its metaethical status, and, instead of being part of some general totality, appear under the sign of an open sequence, and this, and that, and so on. This goal, however, announced with revelation, can only be achieved with redemption. The world will be redeemed only when finally created, that is, ultimately othered. In other words, to let things just be, the Heideggerian Sein lassen, is not yet worthy the name of creation. The mere surge of beings within being, their fleeting appearance within the pre-existing actuality is only a blind impulse within the metabolism of the ontological machine. Creation, on the other hand, is a free act based on ethical decision. Although not arbitrary, it is nonetheless a deed, self-conscious and self-affirming, reflected in the divine Kitov. But although creation surpasses configuration, it is not opposed to it. Unlike in Schelling, where the yes of the revelatory word tries to undo the harm done by the contractive no which created nature, in Rosenzweig, the relation linking yes and no is not antithetical. Yes and no do not form a well of contradiction in God. They are merely his living moments which are connected, indeed, as in the biblical narrative, by the equally primal word, and. The yes of the primordial letting all things be is not negated by the no of the creative revelation. It is continued, transposed, metamorphosed into creation proper by the series of acts linked by the conjunctive end, which builds a narrative sequence, as in the formula and then, which begins most of the sentences in the Hebrew Bible, especially in Rosenzweig's and Buber's translation. I checked it. If primordial configuration is left behind as the past, it is not because it must be repressed, but only because things have moved on. Each present moment renews the revelation which points to the promise of the future. Despite the alternation of yes and no, the story continues the leitmotif of all things coming into being. First, by the passive and general letting be of the primordial configuration, and then through the gradual differentiation characteristic of the creation proper, which leads towards the world filled with strong, self-asserted particulars, all worthy their own proper name. The biblical story, beginning with the first assertion, and that was good, goes on to affirm being till the very end, where everything would eventually become a hero of this greatest heroic poem. Now, readers of Schelling may feel disappointed. Indeed. Readers of Schelling may feel disappointed. Where is the drama, they may ask? Where is the madness of the real, which makes Schelling so fashionably modern nowadays, so Lacanian, Zizkian? Nowhere, I admit. But then, despite all the boringly Aristotelian affirmation of being, from which all signs of the Gnostic Mephistophelian affirmation of nothing have been carefully removed, this is not a story without a suspense. After all, the future of creation, of the ever-deepening and maturing affirmation of being, remains, as in all good stories mediating between unity and chaos, open-ended. It is not conceptually assured as the immanent telos of the philosophical system. Man, the defiant oddity, and Tüche, in the order of being, plays here a messianic role, the outcome of which is not metaphysically guaranteed. Yet, he's also guided by the star of hope and anticipation, which Schelling's project, completely immersed in the tragedy of the real, ultimately denies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bielik Robson. Time for your questions.
Hello. Thank you very much for an excellent paper. Thank you for allowing us to read it.
In a very small print, I'm afraid, but...
I have to say that about 25 years ago, I came to the same conclusions, perhaps not so succinctly expressed and eloquently expressed as you have. So first one comment, and then another question. The comment, I would say, is that the break with the metaphysics of Neoplatonism occurs before Rosenzweig with Bergson. And that's why Rosenzweig is able to utilize the temporality that Bergson opened up.
Yeah.
Okay. And then my question. After seeing all this in Rosenzweig and seeing the enormous debt and gratitude that Levi-Strauss expresses for Rosenzweig, I had to ask myself, who really maintains this sort of unrelating relation, this and, which respects the integrity of its terms without conflating them? Is it the Greek heroicism of Rosenzweig, which the last few pages of your paper have shown so well, the notion of apex, which is a form of Greek agon, or is Levi-Strauss right, that it's the humble, ethical relation before the other that maintains exactly what Rosenzweig opened up in his metaphysics? Now, I decided it was Levi-Strauss.
Okay.
There's no question in my mind. I'm wondering if this is a question for you. Does Rosenzweig's narrative aestheticism, is it capable, as, say, Georges Bataille would believe, of maintaining this impossible relation? Or does it fail? I mean, to me, it does not succeed.
Thank you very much for these great comments. I completely agree with you. Bergson, I tend to read Bergson, unlike, for instance, Deleuze reads Bergson, as already a radically non-Neoplatonic thinker with, indeed, a Jewish messianic concept of the future, which must be left open-ended. You know, it's a kind of an open-ended temporality of a narrative, because as Bergson argues, if it's not open-ended, then it's not a future. So basically, in order to have a concept of the future, we must think this temporality in narrative terms of open-endedness and never a systematic telos. But, you know, without completely contradicting you, I would say, and that's why I introduce Lurianic motif of Tzimtzum, you know, in my account of Rosenzweig, I think that the first radical break with Neoplatonic metaphysics actually occurs with Luria's variation of Kabbalistic Neoplatonism, which is in fact such far-fetched variation that it breaks with its major premises. So the Tzimtzum, breaking of the vessels, introduces those moments of separation within the Neoplatonic flux of being, thanks to which we can, for the first time probably in the history of Western ontology, begin to think othering, that is coming into being of separate units of being, not just parts and parcels of some stream of life, light, and being, but truly separate unities. So, yes, I agree with you. It's there in Bergson, but it's also Rosenzweig. But I would say that the kind of a first harbinger of this very essential and important war waged against Neoplatonism is already there in the 16th century Lurianic invention. When it comes to the, does it satisfy you, this answer? Or do you think that it's too far-fetched and Bergson never had any idea about this?
Once we discover an idea, we can drive its origins back forever.
No, okay, I don't agree with you. I think that, you know, that Scholem is right when he's commenting on Luria's significance, which, you know, for some reason, and that's precisely Scholem's own war with Neoplatonism. He chose Luria as this breaking point in the history of Jewish Kabbalah, and that's precisely this. So, yeah, but obviously, I don't think that there's anything earlier that would sort of like come into this kind of a map of significance. When it comes to your second question, I choose Rosenzweig and his messianic account of Greek tragedy, something he actually shares very interestingly with first Georgi Lukács, who, still being a student of Zimmel, you know, writes a metaphysics of tragedy. It's 1914, and it's the most important essay in Die Seele und die Formen, the soul and the forms. And it's precisely about, you know, it's a kind of a synthesis of Jewish messianic themes and the themes of Greek tragedy. What Rosenzweig does, what then Scholem does in his essay on Trauerlied, the Jewish Kina, what then Benjamin does in The Origin of the German Tragic Drama, is just an elaboration of Lukács' theme, where, you see, he says very clearly that if we want to have a dialogic relation, if we want to have anybody to save as the other must first come into existence. And that's precisely the tragic hero. The history of tragic hero, not completely like Greek tragedy as a whole, right? It's a tragic hero against the chorus, right? It's a silent tragic hero, completely investing in his selfhood. But that's, you know, coming of an individual into his or her individuality. So, yes, I agree with you that, you know, humbleness and this and that, but that must come later. I think Levinas indeed comes after Rosenzweig, also in terms of the kind of a logical sequence. You can't replace one with the other.
Because just as Rosenzweig chooses particularity, Lukács shows that that ends in totality, whereas Levinas chooses singularity.
Yes.
And that makes all the difference. But I'm using too much time.
I saw that there was one more question.
Okay, I appreciate your lecture very, very much, but I want to question your reading of Luria and the Kabbalah. It was to be expected, probably. Look, I do think that this reading is not right. They use the same word, and they, since you mentioned Lurianic Kabbalah, so let's talk about Lurianic Kabbalah. There may be other ways of seeing Kabbalah, but this is Lurianic Kabbalah. And I think it might give an answer also to some of the questions that came up. Lurianic Kabbalah says that there is a light, and this light breaks the vessels. The light is too strong for the vessels to hold. That's why God hid it from only for the righteous, and that's the light of the first day. And then we only see the light on the fourth day of, okay. Now, what is the difference between your reading of that the breaking is everything is broken and now we have to mend it? No, it is that this light, which is, and the word God saw, it's not that it was good, God saw, because it was good. Ki is a word that proves itself. Mm-hmm. That's very often you have in the Bible. Ki sham. Ki, God did that. So God saw, because it was good, that means the minute you can see that primordial light, you can see an ideal world, but only the righteous can see this ideal world. We are blinded, we don't see straight. That's where the word ra'ah is with an aleph, and ra'ah, evil, is with an ayin. So it's exactly, it's like the eye has two skins, you know. So are you seeing things? Do you see straight or you don't see straight? And this is, I think, the answer to the Neoplatonic Aristotelian way of talking about being. Here is a new way of looking at the world, and that's why Lurianic Kabbalah, after the expulsion from Spain, said, very short, the messianic task would be to find these little lights that are all over.
Sure. Yes,
and
of course.
In that sense, of course, it is not a tragic hero. We're all born with this ability to see. That's our normal ability to see. But can you see in this blurred vision? Can you see the redemptive light of the first day? Like the lights of Shabbat reminds you of that. And this is, I think, exactly the answer to Neoplatonism. Look, I studied Kabbalah for 10 years in Jerusalem with Kabbalists and at the Hebrew University. So I see there are two ways of understanding this Lurianic Kabbalah.
Yes.
Really? Okay.
I completely agree with you. And that would probably require a completely separate lecture on the reception of Luria in the 20th century, caused most of all by Scholem's predilections to emphasize the most Neoplatonic, anti-Neoplatonic moments in Lurianic Kabbalah against everything else, right? So you're absolutely right, but for some reason, people like, especially Rosenzweig, Benjamin, Scholem, they decide to pick up certain motifs from Luria that help them in their own anti-Neoplatonic crusade. I'm not saying that they vary true to Luria himself. We don't even know what that means because Luria never left anything in writing, so what would that mean to be true to him? But they very consciously, misread, as Harold Bloom would say, certain motifs in Luria in order, I emphasize that again, strengthen their own anti-Neoplatonic crusade. But I find it actually most interesting because that is really an opening of a completely new metaphysical vision. Perhaps a kind of a metaphysics of late modernity that we can, still elaborate upon after, finally all these Neoplatonic shadows are dispersed. Right? There's no return to a Neoplatonism now, but we can have a new metaphysics, and that's what I was driving at.
Thank you very much, Professor Bielik Robson.